You're watching the Alistair Reign Armed Conflict channel, covering the war on terrorism, human rights, world politics, and military events. This report is an analysis of the committee meetings on the Russian-led attacks in Syria. A United Nations Security Council meeting was held on September 25, 2016. It was during this meeting that Ambassador Amanda Power accused the Russian president and the Syrian president of war crimes in Syria.
Convened the Security Council today because the Russian Federation and the Assad regime have launched an all-out air and ground offensive against eastern Aleppo and its 275,000 civilians. Russia and Assad have reportedly launched more than 150 airstrikes over the last 72 hours, killing at least 139 people and injuring hundreds more, laying waste to what is left of an iconic Middle Eastern city. When violent attacks against civilians are surging, when norms of civilized behavior that we have spent more than 70 years trying to build are being trampled, when there is complete impunity for targeting aid convoys, civilian residential neighborhoods, children, hospitals.
Ambassador Power calls the Russian diplomats bold-faced liars.
When Russia is espousing fiction, we have to call that out. What Russia is sponsoring and doing is not counterterrorism, it is barbarism.
Later that week, on September 29, 2016, at the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Senator Bob Corker called the Obama presidency a failure.
Let me say that one more time. The outburst yesterday from the White House over what happened is remarkable. Russia and Assad realized that there is no plan B. Never has been a plan B. When they wouldn't even sit down to meet with the Secretary of State and us to try to create a solution to a problem that they felt was real. What I believe to be a failed presidency as it relates to foreign policy, an unwillingness to roll up sleeves and deal with the tough issues that we have to deal with, and certainly there's no way to deal with them without conversation.
So, exactly where was the U.S. president? And what could have been more important than preventing another worldwide war? On the day of this UN meeting, September 29, the U.S. president was at Fort Lee Army Base, reminding U.S. troops how superior America is to the rest of the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Fort Lee.
And where was Secretary John Kerry? On September 29, Secretary Kerry was in Washington, being interviewed at a Washington Ideas Forum, where he contemplated the critical Russian-Syria crisis for a televised audience.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us today. We improved our couches from last time you were here because you complained and we took it seriously.
Okay, but where's Defense Secretary Carter? Where could the Defense Secretary be needed that is more immediate than the threat of war with Russia? On the day of September 29, the Secretary of Defense took time to speak to troops aboard the USS Carl Vinson in San Diego before heading to Hawaii.
Defense Secretary Ash Carter delivered a speech aboard USS Carl Vinson in San Diego Thursday. He said
later that day, Defense Secretary Carter arrived in Oahu, Hawaii, to deliver remarks at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, where he spoke about the importance of respecting all nations' right to make their own choices.
Ensuring countries can make their own choices, free from foreign coercion and intimidation.
Oh, well then, I can see why the three most important American players in Syria, each crucial to deciding on a plan B, are all missing in action during this crucial decision-making time. Back to the UN Security Council meeting, where Senator Will Cardin also spoke on the Russia-Syria crisis.
Russia is guilty of war crimes for bombing a humanitarian aid convoy. Assad is barrel bombing Aleppo with impunity and using water access as a weapon, as if denying humanitarian aid was not sufficiently deplorable. These are crimes against humanity.
That is correct. Killing medical and humanitarian staff and civilians is a war crime, unless, of course, the atrocities are committed in the name of the U.S. war on terrorism or their ally, Saudi Arabia's inhumane war on Yemen. That includes the military and forced blockade of humanitarian aid to over 2.3 million Yemeni people who are dying from lack of food and medicine.
I think this is what we've been saying since about 2011. My comments about Secretary Kerry being a sympathetic figure are really not negative towards him. He's out there without the ability to do diplomacy because everyone knows there's going to be no backup effort in the event diplomacy fails, which is a recipe for disaster. We've known that now for 5 years. So again, it's more of an indictment of the President than our Secretary of State. But with that, our Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who we appreciate being here today as a substitute, we thank you for your service, and we look forward to your abbreviated comments. Your written testimony, without objection, will be entered into the record.
Deputy Secretary of State proceeds to state the obvious atrocities being committed in Syria, without giving any substantial replies to the Senator's questions.
Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the civil war in Syria and its regional implications. Now in its 6th year, this civil war has destroyed the fabric of life in Syria. It's killed at least 400,000 people, triggered the worst humanitarian displacement crisis since World War II, put neighboring countries of first asylum under enormous pressure, exacerbated regional tensions, helped swell the ranks of violent extremist organizations, most notably Daesh and al-Qaeda. The conflict continues to be fueled by patrons and proxies with very divergent interests and priorities at a time of unprecedented upheaval in the wider Middle East, as governments pursue new models of political rule and vie for regional influence. In short, the Syria conflict presents one of the most complex challenges we have faced. The United States is clear-eyed about our role and responsibility. The civil war in Syria is not about us, nor can it be solved solely by us, but it challenges our security and strategic interests and our moral values. So we are working to leverage our country's unique capacity to mobilize others to end the civil war and contend with its consequences, even as we lead the international coalition to counter and ultimately defeat Daesh. We're also working to facilitate aid to millions of Syrian civilians, both in Syria and outside of Syria, to try to reduce the human suffering the civil war has engendered. Our primary task is to defeat Daesh, which poses the most immediate threat to our citizens, to our country, to our allies and partners. We have built an international coalition with 67 partners. We devised a comprehensive strategy to attack Daesh at its core in Iraq and Syria, dismantle its foreign fighter financing and recruitment networks, stop its external operations, and confront its affiliates. We are aggressively implementing that strategy, and we are succeeding. Our comprehensive campaign is systematically liberating territory from Daesh and denying its sanctuaries, cutting off its financing, stemming the flow of foreign fighters, combating its narrative, allowing citizens to return home, gutting the twisted foundation on which Daesh's global ambitions rest. We've deprived Daesh of about 25% of the territory it once controlled in Syria and more than 50% of the territory it once controlled in Iraq. And we now face a moment of both strategic opportunity and urgency. The opportunity before us is to effectively eliminate Daesh's physical caliphate by taking back the last big pieces it holds: Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa and Dabiq in Syria. With support from the coalition, local forces are preparing to launch these operations in the period ahead. These battles will be hard, but the consequences to Daesh will be devastating, both practically and psychologically. But this opportunity is matched by urgency. As the noose around Daesh is tightening, we've seen them try to adapt by plotting or encouraging indiscriminate attacks in as many places as possible. This puts a premium on destroying Daesh's external operations network, especially in Raqqa, where many of these operations are plotted, planned, and directed. In Iraq, Mr. Chairman, 2 weeks ago, and then in Turkey this week, I held discussions with our partners on the campaign plan to liberate Mosul, Dabiq, and Raqqa. It requires extraordinary coordination, not just militarily, but also to ensure that we meet the humanitarian, stabilization, and governance needs of newly liberated territory. It will be this effort that ensures that Daesh, once defeated, stays defeated. And Senator Cardin, I think you're exactly right, that in a sense the harder questions are almost what follows the military defeat of Daesh in Iraq and certainly in Syria. Ultimately, we will not fully succeed in destroying Daesh until we resolve the civil war in Syria, which remains a powerful magnet for foreign terrorist organizations that thrive in the war's ungoverned spaces and draw strength from Assad's destruction of his own nation. The objectives and processes that we agreed to earlier this month with Russia were the right ones. A renewal of the cessation of hostilities, the immediate resumption of unhindered aid deliveries, the degradation of and focus on Daesh and al-Qaeda in Syria, the grounding of the Syrian Air Force over civilian populations, the beginning of a Syrian-led negotiating track that can provide a pathway out of the conflict and make possible the restoration of a united, peaceful Syria. The actions of the Assad regime and Russia, aided and abetted by jihadist spoilers, now risk fundamentally undermining this initiative, destroying what was the best prospect for ending the civil war. The September 19 attack on a UN humanitarian aid convoy in Bilateral near Aleppo was unconscionable. It's been followed by the regime and Russia renewing a horrific offensive in Aleppo that includes the killing of hundreds of innocent civilians and apparently intentional attacks on hospitals, the water supply network, other civilian infrastructure. Yesterday, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Kerry informed the Foreign Minister of Russia that unless Russia takes immediate steps to end the assault on Aleppo and restore the cessation of hostilities, the United States will suspend U.S.-Russia bilateral engagement on Syria, including the establishment of the Joint Implementation Center. At President Obama's direction, we also are actively considering other options to advance our goal of ending the civil war and starting a political transition in Syria. We continue to maintain close links to the moderate opposition to support their viability. It's important, as always, to remember how this crisis in Syria began, not with barrel bombs or chlorine, but with peaceful protests of citizens who were calling for peaceful change. The humanitarian catastrophe that we bear witness to is a direct outgrowth of Assad's vengeance against his own people, and indeed the cost is rising every day for the region, for Europe, most of all for the Syrian people. We will continue to work with the coalition we built to defeat Daesh, and we will explore and, as appropriate, pursue every option to end the civil war in Syria and bring about the political transition that the Syrian people want and deserve. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
The persistent question remains unanswered.
There was going to be a plan B if they failed. I've never seen signs of a plan B. I know Russia doesn't believe there's a plan B. Assad doesn't believe there's a plan B. Iran doesn't believe there's a plan B. So when I say that, when I refer to a sympathetic figure, how can a Secretary of State have any chance of success in ending the murder, the torture, the rape, the bombing of innocent people, the killing of young people? How does a Secretary of State have any chance of success when the White House is unwilling at any level to have a backup to what he's doing if diplomacy fails? Give me the elements of Plan B.
So two things. Again, the consequences, I think, to Russia as well as to the regime will begin to be felt as a result of Plan A not being implemented because of Russia's actions. Second, as I indicated, the President has asked all of the agencies to put forward options, some familiar, some new, that we are very actively reviewing. When we are able to work through these in the days ahead, we'll have an opportunity to come back and talk about them in detail, but we're in the process of doing that.
Okay, so let me just say what we already know. There is no Plan B. And when I refer to Secretary Kerry as a sympathetic figure, I say that because he gets up every day. Some say he should resign over lack of support, or at least threaten to. But there's no support. It's impossible to be successful in negotiating an agreement with someone if there's no consequences. In this case, the consequences that you're laying out is that Russia will fully determine the future of Syria.
I think Russia is going to bear very significant consequences for the failure of this effort as a result of
action. That hasn't been the case, and I know that's what the President said when they came in and stepped into the vacuum a year ago. So look, I rest my case. Diplomacy without any plan of failure is something that cannot be successful, and I, again, based on my experiences this weekend with an administration who's unwilling to even sit down and talk about a solution with the people who are involved because they think this is bad for our country, but unwilling to sit down and talk about a possible option.
Senator Menendez also questioned Deputy of State, Mr. Blinken, on whether there was a Plan B or not.
You say in your statement on page 3, ultimately we will not succeed in fully destroying Daesh until we resolve the civil war in Syria, which remains a powerful magnet for foreign terrorist organizations that thrive in the war's ungoverned spaces and draw strength from Assad's brutal destruction of his own nation. And I understand that Secretary Kerry has threatened to end bilateral talks with Russia over Syria, but I can't fathom for the life of me what those talks are producing anyhow. I mean, Russia seems to agree only for the purposes of giving Assad time to rearm and regroup. What leverage do we really have?
Two things. First, we believe that the effort that we've made to reach this agreement with Russia was the best way to effectively move toward ending the civil war, because had it succeeded, and indeed if it still can succeed, and I think we'll know in the hours ahead whether Russia is responsive or not, the cessation of hostilities would be restored, humanitarian assistance would flow, you would get the Syrian Air Force out of the skies over civilian populated areas. Russia would be focused, as it claims it has been, on ISIL and
so
Daesh.
We understand the benefit if it had succeeded.
So that's why we put so much effort into it.
That it's not going to succeed because Russia doesn't want to.
Yeah. So again, I know that this may not fully resonate, but first, Russia escalated its engagement in Syria because it's been there all along, and it's been there for years, precisely because it was at risk of losing its only foothold in the Middle East. And it came in harder in order to save Assad from falling at a time when it looked like he would, although I think that assessment was probably overly optimistic. It's now in a position where, having gotten in, it's very, very hard to get out because Assad cannot win. They can prevent him from losing, but he cannot win. So they're stuck.
Our leverage.
So the leverage, in the first instance, the leverage is, again, the consequences for Russia of being stuck in a quagmire that is going to have a number of profoundly negative effects. First, they're going to be bearing the brunt, if the civil war escalates as a result of their actions, of an onslaught of weaponry coming in from outside patrons. Second, they will be seen in their own country and throughout the world and in the region as complicit with Assad, with Hezbollah, and with Iran in the slaughter of Sunni Muslims. 15% of their own population is Muslim, predominantly Sunni.
They're already, do we agree they're already complicit on that?
Indeed, but this is only going to get worse if the civil...
I'm not sure how these supposed decisions are being discussed when the White House is empty. Because on September 30th, Secretary Carter was attending a party in Hawaii. On September 30th, Secretary of State was speaking at the Major Economies Forum in New York. But who could possibly be more important than the survivors of war in the besieged city of Aleppo?
Well, good morning, survivors of New York traffic.
Later that day, on September 30th, both Obama and Kerry boarded Air Force One to attend the funeral of a politician in Israel. On September 31st, President Obama and Secretary Kerry were in Israel. Watch for Part 2 of this report on the Alistair Reign YouTube channel.